Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak on the subject of regional security relations in East Asia. Before I start, I would like to introduce two headlines related to the Korean situation that appeared in this morning's newspapers in Korea. One says, quote, "Tear of joy turn to regret as reunions come to close," end of quote. The other says, quote, "Tokyo rejects Seoul's sovereignty over North," end of quote. Both headlines beg questions and answers that are not often asked. The first refers to the fact that over the past 2 days, a group of 530 North and South Koreans from 96 families, after 60 years of forced separation, to meet, hug, talk, and cry. They had a maximum of 12 hours together to do all that, and they were wrenched apart once again, and probably forever. Why is it that they, most of them over 70 or even 80 years old, are not allowed to meet again, even communicate, much less live together? The North Korean government claims that it has allowed this one-time reunion to take place for humanitarian reasons. But what humanitarian reasons have prevented them from getting together before and meeting again in the future during the remainder of their limited years of life? The second headline, "Tokyo rejects Seoul's sovereignty over North," refers to the fact that General Gen Nakatani, Japan's defense minister, during his visit to Seoul for a meeting with his South Korean counterpart, did not acknowledge South Korea's stance that North Korea is also its South Korea's sovereign territory, and that Tokyo would need Seoul's consent to ever send troops to the northern parts of the Korean peninsula in case of a military conflict. Why are the Japanese so stingy about the territorial issue and insensitive? And why are Koreans so sensitive and upset about this issue? It is not so much about the present as both about the past and the future. Koreans worry that it might open ways to repeat of what happened in the Korean peninsula more than a century ago. Japanese wish to maintain their freedom to act under their newly acquired, quote, collective self-defense, unquote, prerogatives. With this introduction, and given the limited time I have this afternoon, I would like to briefly review several major developments and their implications for peace and security in Northeast Asia. Let me first start with a metaphor to help us better grasp the complicated nature of the relationships in the region. Although it may be an imperfect metaphor, I would like to suggest perhaps that each bilateral relationship in the region is like a marriage. And I think this metaphor is quite appropriate here because the lunch I had this afternoon took place in a setting that is very similar to a wedding ceremony in Korea these days. And this hall is used very often as a marriage hall for children of Korean diplomats. Some relationships are closer and more trusting than others, and some are full of discord, anger, and distrust. but all have periods of either great tension or harmony at different points in time. No one relationship is ever completely harmonious or perpetually full of tension. At least we hope so. And all relationships are highly dependent on each other, whether they realize it or not. At present, the most prominent and dramatic bilateral relationship in the region seems to be that of the U.S. and China. China's rising power has upset the previous delicate balance in the relationship. China's increased economic power and military capabilities have begun to challenge the predominant power of the United States. With its newly found power, Beijing is actively seeking to change the underlying rules that have been in place since the beginning of the relationship. Likewise, China seems to be seeking to reduce, if not end, the dominance of the United States. It is branding U.S.-led alliances in the region Cold War relics. It is also actively striving to undermine certain elements of the international order, in particular the territorial status quo that have existed since World War II. By establishing a new Asian infrastructure investment bank, China seeks to offer the region an alternative to the World Bank and Asian Development Bank for infrastructure loans. Obviously, China's AIIB initiative and its One Road, One Belt Silk Road project are closely linked. The previous status quo balance has been upset, and both sides are struggling to figure out the new rules of the game. Thus, inevitably, China and the United States are increasingly in competition with each other for regional influence, and the distrust between them continues to grow. The successful launching of AIIB was seen as a victory for China. The successful closing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal was claimed as a win for the United States in its contest with China. A number of China's neighbors also see the country's rising power as a threat. They worry that China could use its growing economic leverage to diminish their response options, so they seek American reassurance and support. In particular, the recent tensions between the United States and China are the result of China's attempt to bring the South China Sea into its sphere of influence using an enlargement strategy. China's construction of a new artificial island by reclaiming in the Spratly Islands region is facing opposition from such countries as the United States, Japan, and other neighboring Southeast Asian countries. President Xi Jinping's most recent visit to the United States and meetings with President Obama vividly illustrate the mixed relationship of cooperation and conflict between these two powers. This brings me to my next point about the warming up of relations between China and Russia. Some have described the coalition making between China and Russia as a new honeymoon. Their growing disputes with the United States and Russia's increasing isolation from the West have brought China and Russia closer together. The two countries have agreed on ambitious oil and gas deals. At the same time, their closer relationship prompted Russia to sign an agreement promoting China's new Silk Road initiative. Before the latest thaw in their bilateral relationship, Russia initially had a lukewarm reaction to the proposed initiative at best. The two countries have also concluded a significant arms deal enabling China to acquire advanced military hardware from Russia. In this marriage of mutual convenience and needs, China seems to be getting the more advantageous end of the deal. America's growing tension with Russia has also developed out of the Russian actions vis-à-vis Ukraine. Russia's annexation of Crimea and military intervention in Ukraine resulted in economic sanctions being imposed by Western countries. Now there's increased involvement by Russia in the Syrian conflict, which is causing alarm in the United States. Some observers argue that the United States' simultaneous antagonism toward the two major world powers has pushed them into a new political and military alignment, if not an alliance. But there are others who assert that because of the unequal nature of relations between Beijing and Moscow and the lack of trust between them, the chances of their forming a closer relationship, much less an alliance, are quite limited. A factor that supposedly prevents closer Sino-Russian ties is also the Russian unwillingness to become excessively dependent on China. Clearly, there's a fundamental lack of strategic trust and the residual mutual suspicion which will exclude the possibility of building a lasting partnership between the two powers. Whatever the case may be with the new Sino-Russian coalition, however, one thing is clear. The continuing development of a stronger relationship between China and Russia is likely to present greater difficulty to the United States in cooperating closely and productively with them bilaterally on regional security issues. It will also affect the ability of the United States to work with the two countries on trust building and the establishment of a regional peace mechanism. Another factor that affects the regional situation is related to the U.S. policy of rebalancing in Asia. To Asia. This means assigning a higher priority of American political, economic, and security resources to the region. One of the fundamental elements of the U.S. policy is to strengthen its relationships with allies such as Japan, Australia, and South Korea, and partners including emerging powers such as India and Indonesia. These strategic plans are being implemented even as the United States continues to undertake greater belt-tightening in its military budget. The policy has also attempted with some success to embed the U.S. in the emerging political security and economic architecture, including the TPP and ASEM, AES. The U.S., on its part, is seeking to counterbalance the growing power of China and trying to convince as many friends as possible to maintain a clear-eyed and rational picture of China's pursuit of power. However, even while implementing the rebalancing policy, the United States has been forced to turn its attention and expend energy elsewhere in the world, such as the Middle East and Europe. The continuing troubles in these parts of the world have made it difficult for the U.S. to pivot away from them. The U.S. policy has also encountered Chinese suspicions that the real objective of the United States in the pivot is to maintain its position of supremacy in Asia and to contain China. In other words, China's strategy of drawing its neighbors and friends closer to itself to gain the upper hand in the regional power balance, as well as the United States' mixed signals of cooperation, competition vis-à-vis China, has the effect of creating greater distrust between both sides. Another bilateral relationship that could be likened to a very troubled marriage is the relationship between Japan and Korea, the two closest allies of the United States. Close neighbors across the Korea Strait, the two countries throughout history have had a checkered relationship of competition, cooperation, conflict, and even domination and being dominated. 70 years after the end of World War II and Korean liberation from 35 years of Japanese colonial rule, they have yet to throw off completely the shackles of the past and move beyond the legacy of history. The Japanese complain that Koreans are never satisfied with Japanese apologies, but keep moving the goalpost for final resolution of the dispute. Koreans complain that Japanese apologies are never sincere or sufficient, and that Japan does not seem to accept Korea as an equal partner. From the U.S.'s standpoint, quarrels between its two Asian allies are a vexing problem, adversely affecting the collaboration not only between them, but also among all the three countries. It also tends to make Korea and China strange bedfellows, both of whom have unsettled grievances toward Japan. It has been 50 years since Korea and Japan normalized their diplomatic relations. There's hope in both countries that Korea will adopt a more generous and magnanimous frame of mind in dealing with the past and move on to the future, and Japan will undertake a more sincere and deeper reflection of the past and present past and present situations. The future of history depends upon how the present leaders of the two countries deal with the past history. I have to be excused on one thing. I don't know if anybody has my text, because I lost half of my text. Thank you. Some recent signals suggest that the Korea-Japan relationship may be slowly on the mend. Following the 50th anniversary of Korea-Japan Normalization Treaty in June, there have been some limited government-to-government contacts. Korea and Japan also agreed to hold a trilateral summit, which also involves China, later this fall. Despite positive signals, Korea and Japan still have numerous contentious issues to overcome. Recently, the United States has welcomed Prime Minister Abe's government cooperating closely with it on the rebalancing to Asia policy generally. Japan has revised the interpretation of its peace constitution to make collective self-defense possible. The Japanese government has agreed on how new defense guidelines with the United States that will allow the use of Japanese forces beyond the defense of the Japanese archipelago proper. Japan is also collaborating closely with the United States on ballistic missile defense projects. Tokyo has also joined Washington in denouncing China's territorial expansion schemes in the South China Sea. This would make the U.S. regard Japan as a much more willing partner in dealing with disputes with China as compared with another close ally, South Korea. South Korea seems to take a somewhat less confrontational approach toward China, even though South Korea has also been strengthening its alliance with the United States on a range of issue areas. It has taken a more cautious and circumspect approach than Japan in disputes between the United States and China. There are several reasons for such a policy. One is that as a divided country facing the North Korean threat of conventional weapons and WMDs, South Korea regards cooperation and coordination with China are critically needed in dealing with the threat. Second, South Korea wishes to find the most effective and pragmatic way to deal with the Chinese challenge without necessarily and excessively antagonizing Beijing. Third, because of the enormous economic interdependence between China and South Korea, Seoul is much more sensitive to the vicissitudes of economic relations with China than Tokyo is. Finally, South Korea believes that the best way to maintain peace, harmony, and cooperation in the region is to find common grounds and interest, dialogue and trust building, rather than confrontation and harsh rhetoric. And these are not my words or even South Korean government's words, but the words of an American called Henry Kissinger. But such attitude of Korea sometimes raises questions like, which side are you on? Are you on Chinese side or on American side? And it's interesting that only 2 days ago, the Financial Times had an article, the title of which is Diplomacy, Asia's Rising Power. Atlantic allies diverge over approach to China relations. And it says, while the U.S. is prepared to chastise Beijing, the UK, Britain, stands accused of selling out for trade. And this reminds me of the predicament and position that Korea is in between the United States and China. But nobody asks a question asks England or Britain the question, which side are you on? Are you on the US side or on China's side? Obviously, Britain is on the US side. And the reason why we keep hearing about such questions is because of the delicate situation here and in some part, somewhat ambiguous position that we ourselves are taking. The regional situation described so far presents both policy dilemmas and opportunities for the various actors. In particular, China, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. The main dilemma for China is that while it wants to change some aspects, namely territorial issues and the dominance of the United States, of the status quo, it may be too premature to flex its muscles. Another dilemma for China is related to dealing with North Korea. While China is quite conscious of the danger and threat that North Korea's nuclear weapons program portends, it has to balance the need to put pressure on North Korea against the desire to maintain what influence it has over the mischievous country, and the need to refrain from pushing it too hard to the brink of reaching a drastic and self-destructive way. The dilemma for Japan is in counteracting the rise of China. How far and how exclusively it should depend on and cooperate with the United States. In the medium to longer term, Japan will find itself continuously falling behind China in economic prowess and national power, and will continue to piggyback on the United States for its security and existence as a major power. Another dilemma for Japan is how to simultaneously become a militarily robust nation in the face of strong domestic opposition, and while also seeking its status as a major player for peace in international forums, such as in the United Nations, for example, as a permanent member of the Security Council. It cannot seek to become a permanent member of the Security Council while its prime minister keeps visiting the Yasukuni Shrine, for example. China is also the source of a major dilemma for the United States, as it has to decide what would be the right mix of cooperation and competition with China, which aspires to share the big and dominant power status with the United States. The United States feels it has to respond strongly to such issues as cybersecurity and South China Sea, but it also recognizes the need to cooperate with China on issues ranging from economy and trade to North Korean nuclear weapons and non-proliferation issues in general. For South Korea, the main policy dilemma stems from the very competitive and often strained relationship between China and the United States. While it hopes and wishes to maintain the comfortable position of being a close military ally of the United States and having China as the largest trading partner, South Korea is often squeezed on issues such as AIIB, deployment of the THAAD missiles, and South China Sea between the United States and China, which often see their interests vis-à-vis the other in a zero-sum game perspective. With regard to Japan, even as South Korea is wary of its unrepentant and regressive attitudes, it has little choice but to cooperate with Japan on security and economic issues. North Korea's nuclear program and the erratic, unpredictable behavior of its new leader, Kim Jong-un, present a peculiar dilemma to South Korea and its neighbors. And Ambassador Hwang Jung-guk talked about this issue at lunchtime in a very able way. Thus far, the reactions of the concerned powers to the North Korean nuclear weapons threat seem to boil down to the following 5 strategies. 1, to pressure North Korea not to conduct more nuclear weapons or missile tests, as it stands now, focusing on preventing the 4th test. And sometimes I compare this to the racing greyhounds chasing after the lure rabbit, because all the countries are now thinking that only if you can prevent North Korea from conducting the 4th test, you have succeeded in dealing with the North Korean nuclear issue. 2, to bring North Korea to a negotiating table such as the 6-party talks. 3, to threaten with tougher and more stringent economic sanctions by the UN Security Council in case of additional tests of nuclear weapons or missiles. 4, to threaten with punishments beyond UN sanctions as the powers did vis-à-vis Iran. 5, to offer inducements such as economic assistance and security guarantee in case North Korea abandons nuclear weapons. So far, none of these measures have shown to be effective in reducing, much less stopping, North Korean nuclear activities. Instead, North Korea's nuclear weapons program is looking increasingly more dangerous in terms of magnitude and capabilities. North Korea's nuclear and missile programs are dangerous not only to South Korea, but to all of the regional countries, including China and Japan. Thus, it may now be time for the United States and others to re-examine their strategic patience approach, which is tantamount to a recipe for inaction. The United States and South Korea should seek to cooperate and coordinate with the rest of the concerned powers, that is China, Russia, and Japan, to work to roll back the North Korean nuclear program, and failing to limit North Korea's nuclear development now means that its program will only get exponentially more dangerous in the years to come. With all these policy dilemmas, one would hope that each country and its leaders would not opt for an extreme choice or position, but rather choose to act in a balanced and discreet way. It has been a quarter of a century since the Cold War ended in the post-Cold War period. The world, and East Asia in particular, shifted from a period of bipolarity to a unipolar power structure under the influence of the United States. The region is now undergoing another transition and shift in power, which can be described as an emerging G2 structure plus an evolving balance of power system. We have a situation in which the continental powers of China and Russia are on one side, and the United States and Japan, essentially maritime powers, are on the other, with South Korea leaning heavily toward the maritime coalition and North Korea remaining isolated but leaning toward the continental one. But this divide between the major powers is not like anything the world experienced during the Cold War bipolar period. We still have time to seek regional cooperation and coordination among all the powers on a range of issues and to construct architecture, peace, security, and prosperity. But it all depends on whether we can make any progress with the North Korean nuclear issue. And in the meantime, we need to try to build trust and confidence not only between the United States and China, but also between Russia and the United States, between China and Japan, between Japan and North Korea, and maybe even between North and South Korea. All these actors are heavily interdependent on one another economically, a fact which both necessitates and enables the countries to seek cooperation and peace. Thank you very much.